Story not that long ago that sometimes you read these things and you wonder, are they true or not? This sounds a little too crazy to be true, but a gentleman who was on board a flight. The flight everything went wrong. It was delayed, and they finally took off, and they had to actually land not long after they took off again at another airport for some repairs. It wasn't anything major, it wasn't anything real scary, but they had to do it, and they were told they were going to spend about an hour on the ground at this airport. They were given the option of exiting the plane, or a choice. They could stay on if they wished. Most people immediately, of course, got off the plane. The gentleman who wrote the story said he initially decided he was going to stay on the plane, but changed his mind after a few minutes, and he kind of passed. There was one or two others on the plane. And he passed by the pilot coming out of the cockpit, kind of looking around the cabin of the plane and seeing a gentleman who was blind, who clearly knew, because he called him by name and said, "Joe, do you want to get out and stretch your legs?" And his response was, I'm comfortable, I'm happy sitting, although I think my dog, my seeing eye dog, could use a little bit of a stretch. And the man, basically, the story went on that the expression on people's faces as the pilot walked off with a seeing eye dog into the terminal, the flight where everything was going wrong. Oh, the joys of it. We're coming to the end of a section of Mark. It's not a real long section. Basically, this is a cutoff for the first half, though, of the Gospel of Mark. Basically, this is the end of the first section, because something really big is going to happen when we pick Mark up again. That just isn't going to happen, though, until the middle of September. But we will get there. And it's actually a good place to stop, because this is, you can look ahead. You can see what's, I'll mention it in a minute, but you'll see what's going to come next in the next little passage. A really major event. Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem. And this is the last town, as he's heading towards Jerusalem, of any major substance. Jericho is now, as he comes into it, is in the heart of Israel. In the heart of the main part of the country. In Mark, up until now, the whole book has occurred kind of, you're from Jerusalem's perspective, out in the boonies. It's happening way out there, either on the edge of the country or even beyond the country. Now, we know from some of the other Gospels, particularly Luke and John, he had gone to Jerusalem before. But Mark, if you were just to read Mark, you wouldn't know that. Mark never records any other trip to Jerusalem. And as he's going there, we run into this blind man, Bartimaeus. Leading to this trip to Israel, or to Jerusalem, Jesus basically does a bunch of battle with the Pharisees, sometimes with his disciples, with the rich young man. And then he starts going to Jerusalem, and as he's going to Jerusalem, he takes a couple of times, it's been 3 sermons worth anyways, of moments to remind the people of why he's come, remind the disciples in particular why he's came. First he talks about, I've come, and we're going to Jerusalem, and in Jerusalem I'm going to be arrested, I'm going to be tried, I'm going to be executed, and 3 days later I'm going to rise from the dead. They don't get it. Not at all. But he reminds them of that. Then he reminds them that they came to serve, that he's come to serve and that they're to serve like him. That he's come as a servant. Now, I want us to think about the fact that Jesus has come for mercy. For mercy. Last week, if you weren't here, you can find it on YouTube, our message. Basically, 2 disciples walked up to Jesus and said, we want to be the most important people in the world. We want to be the absolute most important. And Jesus replies to them, you have no idea what you're asking. Do not be worried about your rights Instead, be worried about serving. Because I have come to serve. And they're kind of nudging. They're trying to, Jesus been talking about all this stuff about death and that. And they're trying to nudge him towards, no, don't focus on that. Don't focus on service. Focus on power. Focus on power. And he doesn't fall for the bait. They want Jesus to arrive in Jerusalem as a conquering king. And in a way, he will. But not in the way they expect. And they have to be reminded in all this. Not just about service, but that the whole point of Jesus coming is about mercy. So Jesus comes to Jericho. Picture the scene. Huge crowd. This is the time of year where people are out on the roads. This is Passover down Jerusalem. Huge portions of the nation are traveling down to Jerusalem. The roads are crowded. There's probably other teachers who are walking along the road with their students crowding around them asking questions. There's families walking around. There's kids running everywhere. It's noisy. If you've got a big crowd walking through a town, do you know what else is going to come out? Well, you're going to get people selling things, right? I mean, some of these folks have been on the road for a while. They got to buy food. They got to buy this. They got to buy their souvenirs and postcards, right? You got to go out and sell them things. So huge throngs are out there. It's kind of like a mall along the main street of Jericho. Huge crowd. And if you're going to get big crowds like that, you got a few people who are along the way begging for money. This particular story is recorded in 3 of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Luke has it happening, we're not entirely sure the order in Luke, but there's some debate about that. But the key thing is there is a big crowd. And in the midst of this crowd, there is a pathetic man who is begging. Probably one of many. Crowds are a good place to go beg. If you want to beg, don't go sit in the field where there's nobody. Go to where all the people are. And that's what he's done. And he's hearing all the things that are happening, and you know, probably he's surrounded mostly by the locals who are standing along the sidewalks, and they're probably talking about all these dumb tourists who are walking down the road. Oh yeah, listen to that group talk. It sounds like they've come all the way from Rome or from Greece or from way over the seas. And see that group? Oh, their kids are out of control. And oh, look at that group. And then finally, one of them says, oh, look. Isn't that Nazarene who is causing all that trouble up north? And Bartimaeus, the blind man, his ears perk up when he hears that. He's heard the stories of the healings and the miracles of Jesus. He may have even heard the story that Mark doesn't record, but occurred not that long before this, of where Jesus helped somebody rise from the dead, a man named Lazarus. Bartimaeus, I think, knew the Old Testament stories. And the memories, as he's hearing these stories of Jesus, the memories of the stories he's heard of the Old Testament are coming up, and he sees something clearly that others are missing. That this teacher is different. And so he calls out, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy. The crowd all around is loud, and it is difficult to make himself heard. And so he cries out again, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy. This stage, as he's yelling out this, everybody around him, shh, quiet. Who's telling him to be quiet? Some have thought maybe it's the disciples or something. I don't think so. I think it's a crowd. I think it's the people of Jericho who are embarrassed at this pathetic beggar who's sitting at their streets, calling out and yelling out to get Jesus' attention. They're probably embarrassed. There's all these guests and visitors. Here's this beggar. Remember hearing the story a number of years ago when Los Angeles hosted the Olympic Games, and they were trying to make the city look pretty and nice, and then they realized, yeah, we've got this huge homeless problem. And so somebody came up with this suggestion, we should buy tuxedos for all the homeless people. Try to dress them up a little bit. It won't be that embarrassing that way. I don't think that actually happened. Didn't get very far. They're embarrassed by it. Shouldn't they have pity on him? If you read the Gospels, though, there was an idea that floated around. The disciples certainly bought into this. That if you were blind, if there was something wrong with you like this, it was either because you had offended God or somebody in your family had offended God greatly and you were being punished. Why don't you show pity to somebody who's being punished by God? Now, Jesus did not believe that. But let's be clear. Disciples bought into it. Jesus did not. They're embarrassed that this pitiful beggar, who they're trying to hide, is calling attention to himself so everybody realizes, hey, we got problems in this town. Jesus calls him over. The crowd says, okay, you can go. Think you should have to yell to get Jesus' attention like that? Ever felt that way? Gospel of Luke tells a story. Jesus tells us, actually, in the Gospel of Luke. The story of a woman who is seeking justice. She's poor, she doesn't have much means to her, so she goes to a judge who is not a very just man. He's corrupt. And she asks him for justice. And he refuses. Get out of my sight. But she keeps coming day after day after day, begging this corrupt judge for justice until finally he breaks down and says, I can't handle it anymore. I don't want you coming back again. Fine. You got justice. You got justice. I'll take care of your problem for you. Well, parable of the persistent widow. You know, in Luke, Jesus teaches that just before they get to Jericho. This is fresh on his followers' minds, this story. What does it mean? And they're percolating this over. Is he saying that God is like this unjust judge who doesn't pay attention? And clearly that's not the point. But the call is to be persistent in our prayers, because this judge eventually listens. I mean, do you think God is going to? And his point isn't if you keep begging God, eventually he's going to change his mind or something like that. The point is more along the line of keep asking, keep praying. You got a need, keep praying. We don't beg to convince God. But we keep begging because it's good for us. I mean, God cares. We know that. Does he hear? The answer is yes. But should we think that we should stop bothering him? Sometimes we might feel that way. Oh, I've asked for this lots and God just doesn't seem to answer. Maybe I should just quit asking. Quit bothering him. And the lesson of this parable and the lesson of this miracle is sometimes there's something that's important for us if we keep asking. Paul talks about the fact that he keeps praying that God will remove a thorn from his flesh. We don't know exactly what that means. But he said he kept asking. Do you know what? Eventually God answered that prayer. It may not have happened in this lifetime. The man was eventually healed. And Paul and Mark and this man Bartimaeus who's calling out, they know God cares. They know God hears. They know God is interested. But I'm going to tell you something. God is more interested in our character and his growth and our growth than he does about our ease and our comfort. Sometimes we just got to keep praying because it's good for us. Sometimes it gives us a new creative way to look at our struggles. Sometimes it gives us a new perspective. The story of the blind man who walked into a store with a seeing-eye dog. Just being blind goes with the message. All of a sudden he picked up the dog by the leash and began swinging the dog over the top of his head. The manager ran up to him and said, "What are you doing?" And he replied, "Oh, I'm just looking around." You know, sometimes we're forced to keep coming to God because it breaks down our ego, it breaks down our ambitions, it breaks down all of those parts of us that are strong and shows us that we need Jesus because we need mercy. We need mercy. And the man cries out, "Son David, have mercy on me." A little later, he gets this reply from Jesus. He throws off his cloak, he springs up, comes to Jesus, replies that, and the question of what do you want me to do for you, replies, "Rabbi, let me recover my sight." Jesus' response, this whole son of David is interesting. This is the first time that somebody refers to Jesus as the son of David. It's interesting because this sinful, pathetic man is the one who gets to pronounce him as king. What a great honor. I said you might want to look ahead to next time, what the next passage. I'll give you the hint. It's Palm Sunday. It's the crowds lining the streets yelling, "Hosanna!" It's Jesus entering as king. And this man sets the stage for Jesus to enter as king. And what is his call that he needs from this king? It is mercy. And what is mercy? It is God's response to humanity. We live in a world of war, hatred, crime, and God's response to that is something we call mercy. The indifference that humanity shows towards its Creator. The apathy to the things that He cares about. That's mercy. His response is mercy. This play that we just did, we ended with the verses, if we confess our sins. That word "if" might be the key word. Not everybody is going to do it. But when we do, we come into contact with Him and discover that His arms are indeed open wide. The Greek word for mercy is, if you want to learn a little Greek, is eleos. I looked it up in my big multi-page dictionary, multi-volume dictionary. It said in ancient Greek, mercy was this: the emotion roused by contact with an affliction which comes undeservedly upon someone else. I.e., that's fancy talk for saying, I feel bad that something wrong happened in your life. I feel bad that things are going wrong for you. But then my dictionary continues, says, that's how the world saw mercy, but the New Testament takes it a different direction. Not that I feel bad that you've had some bad luck or something like that. It takes it a very different way. Let me read that definition. The breaking in of a divine response into the reality of human misery. The full demonstration of which exists within Jesus. What is mercy? It is God breaking in when we struggle. It is God responding to me in compassion. The problem is, of course, unless we recognize we have a problem, we have no need for it. Unless I recognize that I have needs. And when I recognize my need, my response should be like Bartimaeus up here. Toss off my cloak and race blindly to Jesus, who has all the solutions to our problems. As Jesus' response is this: go your way. Your faith has made you well. Immediately recovered his sight and followed him along the way. Faith is my response to the mercy of God. You know, his posture in all this speaks volumes. Initially, he is sitting down underneath the crowds in the dirt. And Jesus calls, and it doesn't just say he stands up, he springs up, he jumps, and he runs. And then he walks, he follows Jesus, he walks alongside. His posture in all this speaks volumes. He goes from the one sitting in the dirt under the crowds to springing up to Jesus, to walking and following him. Last week, the disciples went to Jesus and they asked him, "Can we ask you something?" He said, "Well, what do you want?" And he denies their request. This week, somebody comes up to him and says, calls him out, and he says, "What do you want?" He asks the same question, but this time he gives a positive response. Sometimes when we ask of Jesus, we're looking out of our own ambitions, our own desire to make my life easier or better. But here we have a man who's asking in his desperation and saying that I'm in hopeless need. In his begging, he does not barter with God because he has nothing to barter. The disciples wanted comfort, they wanted prestige, they wanted their wants looked after. Yet here is a man who needs mercy. And he knows it, and he's given it. He knew that he was living in a world and a life of sin. And he had a God who was not just willing to help, but a God who was desperate to help him. Faith can be a dangerous thing. It's interesting that at the beginning of this passage he's called Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus. He's not called a blind beggar. It's not said that there was a man named Bartimaeus. The way it is written is like this. You know Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus? That guy? Do you know what his story is? You've heard of him, right? He's probably been in the midst of your church as Mark is reading this. Because he's somebody who it's written as if he is familiar. Matthew's gospel tells the story slightly different. There are two men, two blind beggars. We're not told anything about the second one. Mark doesn't even mention why, because I think the second beggar is probably being forgotten. They don't know who he is. But Bartimaeus is familiar to the early church. There's a degree of familiarity, and because of that, that must mean, what has he done with his life since then? He didn't just take this healing and go off and try to make a few bucks. He went and tried to make a difference for Jesus. I can think of no other reason why there'd be that degree of familiarity in the way he's introduced. Why this second beggar is kind of forgotten. We don't know what happened to him. But this man, because of his faith, goes and makes a difference in his world. Healing is not just for the sake of healing. Healing is so we go and make a difference in the kingdom of God. This little section of Mark is teaching three things. He first teaches them they came to die and to rise again. Then he teaches them they came to serve, and now he emphasizes that I came to bring mercy. I came to respond to your struggles. We're going to sing a hymn in just a moment that is inspired by the book of Lamentations in the Old Testament. Now some people might say, what on earth is that? It's a book about crying. That's what Lamentations means. It is people who are in a desperate situation who cry out to God. But there is hope that comes in the midst of their cries, and it inspires some of the things that are said in that little book. Inspire this: great is thy faithfulness. Do we see the faithfulness of God? amidst the struggles? Because God came for those who are desperate. God came for those who are in need. God came to bring each one of us love and hope. I'm going to invite our worship team.